Control rarely survives contact with indifference, and that is the one weapon a narcissist can never confiscate from you. Most people try to end a narcissist's grip through argument, through evidence, through a slow accumulation of proof that should, by any reasonable standard, force accountability. It never does, because control was never built to respond to reason. It was built to respond to reaction. There is a single sentence, delivered without anger and without explanation, that removes the one thing their entire system depends on: your emotional participation. Once that participation stops, the mechanism that has been running the relationship has nothing left to feed on. The control does not end because you won an argument. It ends because you stopped supplying the argument. That sentence is simple. This isn't going to work for me. No raised voice, no follow-up justification, no timeline for when you'll feel differently about it. Just 5 words that close a door instead of opening a debate. It sounds almost too plain to matter, and that is exactly why it works. A narcissist is prepared for anger. A narcissist is prepared for tears, for pleading, for the long, exhausting monologue where you explain, for the 100th time, why their behavior hurt you. What they are not prepared for is a sentence that offers nothing to argue with. There is no accusation buried inside it for them to deny. There is no emotion inside it for them to twist. There is only a boundary, stated once and left standing on its own. To understand why this works, you have to understand what control actually runs on. It does not run on love, and it does not run on respect. It runs on your reactions. From the earliest days of the relationship, a narcissist studies you the way an engineer studies a machine, not to understand your heart, but to map your pressure points. They learn what makes you defensive, what makes you anxious, what makes you chase, and what makes you apologize for things that were never your fault. Every guilt trip, every silent treatment, every flash of charm right when you were about to walk away, all of it is calibrated against that map. It is not random cruelty. It is a system, and every system needs fuel. Your fear is fuel. Your confusion is fuel. Your explanations are fuel. Even your anger, as justified as it is, becomes fuel because it proves the machine is still working. This is why the instinct to argue your way out of a narcissist's grip almost always backfires. You believe that if you can just find the right words, present the situation clearly enough, or stay calm long enough while they stay chaotic, the truth will eventually land. It won't, because you are trying to use logic on a system that was never designed to process logic. It was designed to process reactions. The moment you open a debate, you have handed them exactly what they needed. Now there is something to analyze, something to redirect, something to pick apart. They will find the one inconsistency in your 3-minute explanation and spend the next hour making that inconsistency the entire conversation. You end up defending your right to have a boundary instead of simply having one. This is not an accident. It is the most reliable tool in their kit because almost everyone falls for it at least once. Picture the pattern. You say you're upset about something specific, a broken promise, a dismissive comment, a moment where you needed support and got sarcasm instead. Instead of acknowledging it, they ask why you're always so sensitive. Instead of sitting with the discomfort, they remind you of a time you made a mistake, as if your past error cancels their present behavior. Within minutes, you are no longer talking about what actually happened. You are defending your character, your memory, your right to feel anything at all. This is not confusion on their part. It is redirection. And it works because you keep supplying new material every time you try to make them understand. The single sentence removes that material entirely. There is nothing to redirect when you haven't given them a debate to redirect. Think about how many hours of your life have already gone into this exact loop. You rehearse the conversation on the drive home. You choose your words carefully, soften the edges, add context so it can't be misread. You deliver it as gently as you know how, and somehow, by the end, you're apologizing for bringing it up in the first place. This isn't a failure of your communication skills. Your words were never the actual obstacle. The obstacle is a listener who isn't trying to understand you, only to locate the fastest route back to being in control of the exchange. No amount of careful phrasing closes a door that was never designed to be closed by phrasing. Only a boundary, held without needing to be re-explained, does that. It's worth naming, too, why the explanation habit is so hard to break, because it isn't a character flaw. Most people were taught, from childhood onward, that fairness means giving your reasons, that a decision without justification is somehow rude or incomplete. That instinct serves you well with reasonable people. It becomes a liability with someone who treats every reason you give as a new thread to pull. The shift isn't learning to stop caring about fairness. It's learning that fairness here doesn't require your explanation at all. It only requires that your boundary be true and that you're willing to stand behind it without an audience's approval. Here is the part almost nobody explains clearly enough. The sentence only works if you can hold it without needing them to agree with it. That distinction matters more than anything else in this video. Most people say the words, but they say them the way you'd say them to someone reasonable, expecting a nod, expecting understanding, expecting the conversation to end because you made a fair point. A narcissist doesn't operate on fairness. If you say, "This isn't going to work for me," and then wait visibly for their approval before you feel entitled to act on it, you have quietly reopened the negotiation. The sentence has to function less like an opinion you're offering and more like a fact you're reporting, not a request for permission, a statement of what is already true. This is where the second layer comes in, because a sentence without follow-through is just a sound. If you say the words and then keep answering the calls, keep replying to the messages, keep showing up despite the disrespect, the sentence gets filed away as noise, one more thing you said in the heat of the moment that didn't actually mean anything. Action is what turns a sentence into a boundary. That doesn't require a dramatic exit or a scene. It can be as quiet as ending the call after you've said it, or not responding to the follow-up message designed to reopen the conversation, or simply not being available the next time they test whether the line was real. Consistency is what a narcissist actually tracks, far more than the emotion behind your words. If the boundary holds every single time, it stops being something to push against and starts being something they have to plan around. And they will test it, because testing boundaries is not an occasional behavior for a narcissist. It is closer to a reflex. The first response to your calm sentence is rarely acceptance. More often, it's an increase in the very tactics that used to work. If guilt has moved you before, expect more guilt, delivered with more urgency this time. If anger has made you back down before, expect the anger to escalate, sometimes sharply, because on some level, they are recalculating, trying to find the setting that used to get a reaction and turning up the intensity when the usual dial doesn't respond. This is not proof that your boundary is cruel. It is proof that it is working. The discomfort you feel in that moment is not a signal that you did something wrong. It is the sound of a system losing its grip on a resource it assumed would always be available. The testing itself tends to follow a shape you can learn to recognize almost in advance. First comes the direct push, a repeated request framed as something small, something reasonable, something that surely doesn't count as breaking the rule you just stated. Just this once. It's different this time. You're overreacting to something minor. If the sentence holds through that stage, the pressure often shifts from direct to indirect. Suddenly, a mutual friend mentions, almost in passing, that you've seemed distant lately. A family member wonders aloud whether you're being too rigid. The pressure hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed its point of entry, because a system built on finding leverage doesn't give up when the first lever fails to move you. It looks for the next one. What makes this stage genuinely difficult isn't the tactics themselves, it's the self-doubt they're engineered to produce. You start to wonder whether you're being unreasonable, whether 5 words really was too harsh, whether a person who truly cared would have offered more explanation. That doubt is not a sign that your boundary was wrong. It's the predictable residue of years spent inside a dynamic that trained you to treat your own certainty as suspect. Recognizing that residue for what it is, rather than treating it as new information about your judgment, is often the difference between holding the sentence and quietly abandoning it 3 days later. If the escalation doesn't restore the old dynamic, the story often changes shape entirely. Suddenly, you're the one being unreasonable. You're cold, you've changed, you used to be so much easier to talk to. Notice what's happening underneath that accusation. It has nothing to do with who you actually are and everything to do with who you used to be for them, which is someone reachable, someone who could be reasoned with into staying quiet. When that version of you stops showing up, the only explanation their internal narrative can offer is that something is wrong with you now, because the alternative, that you were never the problem, is far harder for that narrative to survive. There's a particular moment worth naming here, because it tends to arrive quietly and catch people off guard. It's the moment right after you've said the sentence and held it, when the response isn't rage, but a strange, sudden softness. A memory brought up at just the right time, a comment about how things used to feel easier, an acknowledgement that almost sounds like the apology you've been waiting years to hear. It can feel for a moment like proof that the words finally worked, that they finally understood. Pay close attention to what that softness is actually reaching for. It is rarely reaching for the person you are now, steady, boundaried, no longer available for the old patterns. It is reaching for the version of you that existed before the sentence, the version that could still be pulled back in with the right memory delivered at the right time. The warmth is not evidence of change. It's evidence that the old strategy failed and a new one is being tested. This is exactly why the sentence has to be paired with something steadier than hope, because hope is precisely the hook this next phase is built to catch. You don't need them to confirm that your boundary landed. You don't need an apology to validate that you were right to set it. The sentence was never a request for their understanding in the first place. It was a description of your own limit, and your limit doesn't require their signature to be real. Consider what actually happens on the emotional ledger the moment you stop reacting. For years, maybe, every interaction fed the pattern, whether you were angry, hurt, pleading, or placating. Each of those responses, even the negative ones, confirmed that you were still emotionally reachable, still inside the loop. A calm, brief sentence followed by consistent action removes your name from that loop entirely. There is no thread left to pull, no pressure point left exposed for the next attempt. This is not the same as punishing them, and it isn't designed to be. It is simply the natural consequence of no longer being available as a source of reaction. Somebody who has spent years drawing from your emotional responses will feel that absence acutely, not because you intended to hurt them, but because the absence itself is unfamiliar territory for a system that has never had to function without an audience. It helps to understand why brevity carries so much more weight than a long, careful explanation ever could. A long explanation, however well-intentioned, hands over dozens of small openings. Every clause becomes something to challenge. Every qualifier becomes something to twist. Every attempt at fairness becomes an opportunity to argue you out of your own conclusion. 5 words leave almost nothing to work with. That is not coldness. That is precision. You can be warm in every other part of your life and still refuse to hand someone the raw material they need to talk you out of your own limits. Confidence in a boundary doesn't announce itself through volume. It shows up through economy, through the willingness to say the true thing once and let it stand without needing to be defended into existence. There's a reason this particular kind of calm unsettles a narcissist more deeply than open conflict ever could. They are, in most cases, extremely well prepared for conflict. Confrontation gives them a stage, an opponent, a reason to escalate, a chance to reframe the entire exchange around who's right and who's wrong. A flat, undramatic sentence offers none of that. There's no stage to perform on, no accusation to deflect, no emotional current to redirect into blame. What's left is simply the fact of the boundary, sitting there, unmoved by whatever comes next. That stillness is precisely what so many people mistake for weakness in themselves, when it is, in nearly every case, the clearest evidence of strength available. None of this requires you to become someone harsh or someone who has stopped feeling things. You are allowed to still care what happens to them, to still feel a pull toward the good memories, to still wish, somewhere quiet inside you, that things had gone differently. The sentence isn't a demand that your feelings disappear. It's a decision about what you will and will not keep participating in, regardless of what you still feel underneath it. That distinction between managing your feelings and abandoning your boundary because of them is where most people get stuck, and it's exactly where this approach asks you to stay steady. If you're recognizing this pattern in your own life right now, in a parent, a partner, a friend who has never once let a disagreement end without turning it into a referendum on your character, take a moment to actually notice that. Recognition like that isn't comfortable, but it's the first real step out of a loop that depends entirely on you not seeing it clearly. And if any part of this is landing, subscribing costs nothing. But it means these ideas reach the next person still stuck in the exact conversation you used to have on repeat. If you've ever said a version of this sentence yourself and watched the dynamic shift, even slightly, put it in the comments. Somebody reading it tonight needs to know it's not just a theory. There is a longer arc worth understanding here too, because the sentence rarely produces an instant transformation in the other person, and it was never supposed to. What it produces, reliably, is a transformation in you. The first time you say it, your voice might shake. You might rehearse it 50 times in your head before you ever get the chance to use it. That's normal, and it doesn't undo the effect. What matters is that you said it and then let your actions match it, even imperfectly, even nervously. Each time you repeat that alignment, the sentence gets easier to hold. Not because the other person has softened, but because you have stopped needing them to. Somewhere in that repetition, something quietly flips. You notice you're no longer rehearsing your defense in the shower before a conversation that hasn't even happened yet. You notice the guilt trips land with less force, not because they've stopped, but because you've stopped handing them somewhere to land. You notice that the accusations of being cold or different or unrecognizable sting less, because you understand now what they actually mean. They mean the old strategy is failing, and failure, to a system built entirely on your reaction, feels like an emergency. That emergency shows up in specific, recognizable ways, and it helps to know them so you're not blindsided. Expect an increase before you see a decrease. Expect messages at odd hours, sudden nostalgia, references to how things used to be, maybe even a version of concern that sounds almost convincing. Expect in some cases an attempt to recruit other people into the story, friends, family, even people you both know, framed in a way that quietly repositions you as the one who changed, who got cold, who stopped trying. None of that is a referendum on the accuracy of your boundary. It is the predictable turbulence of a system trying to restore an old equilibrium it no longer has access to. There's also a quieter version of this turbulence that deserves its own mention, because it rarely gets discussed and it can be more disorienting than the loud version. Sometimes, instead of escalating, the response is a kind of theatrical acceptance. A calm, almost gracious, if that's what you need. It can sound on the surface like maturity, like exactly the response you'd hoped for. Watch what happens in the weeks that follow, though, and the pattern usually reveals itself. The boundary gets tested anyway, just more slowly, more subtly, through small requests that edge right up to the line without quite crossing it, through favors framed as harmless exceptions, through a gradual reintroduction of the exact behavior the sentence was meant to end. Graceful acceptance in these cases isn't surrender. It's a longer, quieter version of the same test, run at a pace designed to avoid triggering your alarm. This is precisely why consistency matters more than any single conversation. A boundary that holds once but bends the second time it's inconvenient teaches exactly the opposite lesson from the one you intended. It teaches that the sentence is negotiable under enough pressure, applied for long enough, from enough different angles. A boundary that holds the 10th time exactly as firmly as the first teaches something a narcissist's internal system has no real way to argue with, because it isn't an argument. It's simply a fact about how you now operate, repeated until it stops being newsworthy. What makes the sentence sustainable over weeks and months rather than a single conversation is that it doesn't require you to win every one of those subsequent attempts individually. You don't have to out-argue the smear campaign. You don't have to defend yourself against every reframed memory. You simply have to keep returning to the same quiet fact. This isn't going to work for me, and I'm not available to keep discussing why. Said once, held consistently, it does more over time than the most articulate argument said 100 times ever could, because arguments invite rebuttal, and simple, repeated boundaries eventually stop inviting anything at all. There's a particular kind of peace that shows up on the other side of this, and it rarely arrives the way people expect. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like the dramatic ending you might have imagined during the worst nights of the relationship. It feels quieter than that, almost anticlimactic. You'll notice one day that you didn't brace yourself before checking a message. You'll notice you told the story of what happened to you without your voice catching in the middle of it. You'll notice that your sense of what you deserve no longer depends on whether they ever come around to seeing it the same way. That is not a small shift. That is the entire point. None of this promises that the other person changes. In many cases, they don't, and it isn't your responsibility to make that happen. What changes reliably is your position inside the dynamic. You stop being the source they can always return to, the reaction they can always provoke, the explanation they can always demand. And once that position shifts, once your emotional participation is no longer something they can count on, the mechanism that ran the whole relationship simply runs out of what it needs to keep running. Not because you defeated them in an argument, because you stopped supplying the argument, and a system that was never built to function without your reaction cannot, in the end, survive on silence.